The Progressive Legacy is produced by the University of Wisconsin Stevens Point and funded in part by the Wisconsin Humanities Council, serving on behalf of the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening and welcome to UWSP and this very exciting evening program. I am Justus Paul, Professor of History and Dean of the College of Letters and Science, and it's my privilege to be the moderator for this first session. I would like to begin by introducing the members of our panel. I will follow that with a very brief statement for the two people in the audience who don't know what the Progressive Period was about. I know the rest of you do, but the rest of you bear with me. It's just for the two who weren't prepared. And then we will go directly to a discussion among the members of the panel. To my right, and there's nothing intended by their position on the panel except for alphabetical, helps me keep them straight. To my far right is Professor Patrick Maney from the Tulane University in New Orleans. Pat is the author of a biography of Bob La Follette Jr. entitled Young Bob La Follette. He's also the author of a biography of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And many of you will recognize with a great deal of pride that he's a boy from Stevens Point and a graduate of UWSP. And welcome back, Pat. Thanks. Next to me is Professor John. To my immediate right is Professor John Miller, Professor of History at South Dakota State University in Brookings, South Dakota. He's the author of the biography of the other young La Follette, Governor Phil La Follette. Book entitled Governor Philip La Follette, Wisconsin Progressives and the New Deal. Also has an article on progressivism and the New Deal in Wisconsin Magazine of History. To my immediate left is Dr. Michael Stevens, a state historian of the State Historical Society of Wisconsin. Many of you will recognize him as the author of the Letters from the Front book, which came out about a year and a half ago. He's been doing a number of things of this nature. He's currently working on the history of the Milwaukee Socialists and editing the papers of Victor Berger, and he informed me just a few minutes ago that a book entitled The Family Letters of Maida and Victor Berger will be out probably in May of this year. Welcome, Michael. To my far left, nothing intended by that, is the Honorable Frank Zeidler, who was National Chairman of the Socialist Party of America from 1973 to 1984, was the mayor of the city of Milwaukee from 1948 to 1960, was Secretary of the Socialist Party of Wisconsin from 1960 to 1984, and was the Socialist Party candidate for President of the United States in 1976. Welcome, Mayor Zeidler. with that done, a very, very brief introduction to progressivism as a movement and as a period to sort of hopefully set the stage for something for our panelists to dig into and move on. Progressivism, in its simplest terms, was a reform period, a reform movement which swept the nation during the early years of the 20th century. It had a major impact on the course of history, politics, economics, and society in general. It built itself out of the protest movements of the latter part of the 19th century, in particular the populist movement, from which many of the specific reform programs produced by the progressives originally had been formed. Progressivism became a national force in about 1901. We historians hedge a lot, but about 1901, 1915, 1916, it was the dominant major political force in the country, after originating at the city and state level prior to that time. The high point of the progressive era nationally came between 1910 and 1914, and some of you, Bob Williams is the only one I know of, probably voted in 1912 in the three-way election race between Democrat Woodrow Wilson, who was by then a reformist progressive Democrat, Teddy Roosevelt, who had broken with the Republican Party to head the Bull Moose, our National Progressive Party ticket, and the third place finisher, the incumbent president, William Howard Taft, the stalwart Republican. During the next couple of years, during Wilson's administration, much of the major legislation, both political and economic, occurred for which the Progressive Party is most known on the national level. With the onset of World War I, progressive fervor began to decline, at least insofar as legislation was concerned, and the activities diminished. But many of the elements of progressivism came back again in the form of parts of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, Harry Truman's Fair Deal, and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, and in a number of other ways, some of which I'm sure we'll talk about this evening. Why progressivism in Wisconsin? Because Wisconsin was sort of, in many ways, the birthplace of progressivism. It was a laboratory for democracy. It was the place where Bob La Follette began his career. It was a state which, as it is today, it was often ahead of itself in national political circles and events. It is more than just what went on in the nation. The ideas of Bob La Follette continued long after he left the political scene in 1925. During the 1920s and 30s, the work of the progressives was carried on by the younger generation of La Follettes, by William T. Eviu of the Capital Times in Madison, and a number of other persons, too numerous to mention. For the most part, their work was carried out within the Republican Party, which was fragmented into two very serious divisions during most of this time. In the 1930s, the progressives formed, with the help of labor, a progressive party, which did not last very long, and again, we will get to talk about that some as we go along this evening. As that party met its demise in the early 40s, the Wisconsin Democratic Party began its comeback, and that will be the subject of one of these sessions in a couple, 3 weeks. It was not, though, until the late 1950s that most authorities agree that Wisconsin returned to a true two-party system in the same terms as other states, with a Republican and a Democratic Party. For all intents and purposes, Wisconsin, for nearly 100 years, was a one-party dominated state, but that party was fragmented between stalwarts and progressives. Very quickly, then, the other progressive force in the state is represented tonight by Mayor Zeidler. The socialist movement in this state was also ahead of that in many of the other states during this period of time. The socialist tradition dominated much of Milwaukee's politics throughout, frankly, the first half of the century or more. Mayor Zeidler left office, I believe, in 1960, if I'm not mistaken. But socialism was not only strong in Milwaukee County, it was also strong in Marathon County and a few other places around the state, particularly during the progressive era. Mayor Seidel, Mayor Hone, and then later Mayor Zeidler, along with Congressman Victor Berger and others, also had their own brand of progressivism. Progressivism, then, was an attempt to respond to the problems of society, problems brought on by big business, by railroad domination, by the thought that Eastern bankers had too much power and control. It was an attempt to react through government to meet the challenges of the late 19th century and into the 20th century. Whether reformers were farmers, laborers, or whatever, at some time or another, almost every American was a progressive on some issue during the first 30 or 40 years of this current century. So progressivism and its uniqueness and its unique role in Wisconsin are why we're here tonight and why we hope that we can hold your attention and keep you interested in a really exciting theme for another 11 weeks after tonight. I'd like to begin the discussion then by asking Professor Miller to have at my definition of progressivism and elaborate, tear it apart, be kind.
Well, that's quite a mouthful you gave us there. A nice summary lecture, I think, on progressivism over a long period of time. I think I'd just like to hone in on a couple of points you made there and open it up to the rest without trying to exhaust this. But one point that's quite clear is that progressivism is a word that applied to a long span of time. We're talking from, say, the mid, even early 1890s up. If you go beyond the death of the Progressive Party in 1946 up through the 1950s. So we have a word, progressivism, that applies to a lot of individuals, a lot of groups and organizations, a lot of programs, plans, and everything else over more than half a century. And that means that progressivism is a term that obviously was changing over a period of time and took on different definitions. My own particular interest in progressivism is in the 1930s and Governor Phil Follett, and especially when they started the Progressive Party in 1934. There wasn't a debate so much over whether to start the party because that was pretty well settled at the Fond du Lac Convention before they even came together. The big debate was, what shall we name it? And after a long impassioned speech by Phil Follett, they decided to name it the Progressive Party and not the Farmer Labor Party. And Phil pointed out just how important the word is, just how important the terminology is, progressive, that it meant something to a lot of people, and that it meant fervor, it meant idealism, it meant something very meaningful to people. On the other hand, if they had called themselves the Farmer Labor Party, that would have meant something too, which gets into another aspect of who were these progressives. And in those days, yet they still defined themselves as farmers, laborers, and small businessmen. And that was the core strength of the progressives when Phil tried to expand the base of the Progressive Party in 1938 with his National Progressives of America and bring in more middle-class people, maybe some businessmen and so forth. He ran into a lot of trouble. So before I give quite as long a definition as you do, I'd just like to suggest in the first place that progressivism is a word that changed its meaning over a long period of time and that defined itself often in terms as much what it was against as what it was for, because progressives started from a dualistic frame of reference. We are the people. We are against the interests, the privileged interests, the rich, the wealthy, the big corporations, and wealthy privilege in general. And as time went on, and then it became Hoover and the Hoovercrats and so forth. And I would suggest that somewhere at the heart of progressivism is this dualistic frame of reference that always needs an enemy. And when they lost the capacity to define what that enemy was, then they were in a bit of trouble.
Professor Maney, would you care to?
Well, I would add a few things. Progressivism did indeed exist over a long period of time, and an awful lot of people were in and out of the progressive movement, but I think there were some characteristics that were constant over time. Most progressives were moderate in the sense that they wanted to preserve capitalism and democracy, but they wanted to make them work better. They were optimistic, and I mean this is, I think, hard for us in a really cynical time when we think that government can't do anything right and society can't do anything right. The progressives believed that the country faced great problems, that if something were not done about those problems, we would be in a lot of trouble. But they had this optimism, this faith that they could master these forces, a faith, I think, that has greatly diminished in recent years. They also had they were self-righteous. I mean, this you alluded to too. I mean, they were the elder La Follette, Fighting Bob, had his enemies, and he left his path to power strewn with friends, former friends and supporters. They tended to translate issues into great matters of morality, good and evil. But finally, I would come back to the matter of government, and this is also, I think, really hard for us to understand. Progressives were willing, as previous generations weren't, to use government to help deal with the problems of the time. And I mean, they looked upon government as their government, something that could help, that could liberate individuals. And that's a sense, I guess, which seems to have been lost. But those are, what I'm saying is that over a long period of time, a lot of people were progressives, but there were, I think, certain identifiable characteristics that existed.
Mayor Zeidler, to what extent did the Wisconsin Socialists fit into this definition?
Well, first of all, let me divert a little bit and say that I consider this series that you're having here a remarkable one in view of the fact that national forces and state forces are set in motion now to overturn everything we're talking about and all the history. Concerning the progressive movement, the socialist movement and the progressive movement came from, as I perceive it, two different sources. The progressive movement had a base in rural Wisconsin among the farmers and the small business people. And the idea was that you would regulate the self-interests of society, which had produced the large corporations, and use government, as it was said, to control and regulate that self-interest. The socialist movement came out of Europe and was largely a product of the working class of Great Britain, and France and Germany. It was a movement that said that you can't regulate that self-interest successfully, and instead of having private people run the railroads and the mines and so on, that ought to be under public ownership. Where there was a commonality of interest between them is that both groups believed that by the governmental process, the ballot, you could change matters and at least begin a regulatory process, ultimately, as the socialists thought, leading into public ownership of the basic means of production and distribution. Socialist movement was concentrated largely in the southeastern part of the state, some of it being in the German areas of the northern part, like in Marathon County. And that only at one time was there a commonality of activity between them. That was a period from 1935 to 1941, when there was a Farmer Labor Progressive Federation, which had included in it the Socialist Party, which went off the ballot in 1935. That movement broke apart in 1941 when Phil La Follette largely began to move in another direction toward what socialists thought was a more conservative republicanism.
Dr. Stevens, your work with Victor Berger, how would you assess the role of socialism as a part of the progressive movement?
Well, Victor Berger wrote in one of his letters, these progressives make me sick. Give me an honest reactionary any day than a progressive. What he saw the progressive movement doing is undercutting the socialist program in the early part of the 20th century. Berger did not reject the idea that bigness was good. For the progressives, in a sense, were looking both forward and backward. You know, they were looking forward to a increased role on the part of government, but they were also looking back to era before the big industrial organizations. And they hoped that through regulation, through antitrust laws, that they could restore some of the life of the 19th century. Berger didn't believe bigness was bad. He said this was the natural order of things as capitalism naturally led to socialism, and thought it set the stage for government ownership of large combinations, large businesses.
Do you believe that he would reject all the views of Roosevelt and Wilson in 1912, for example, and their new nationalism and their programs of government regulation? Or would he see this as a step towards ultimately the socialists succeeding by letting government fail in its attempt to regulate?
No, unlike other socialists, Berger considered himself on the right wing of the Socialist Party and believed in cooperating with progressive reforms. He saw this as a logical step towards the eventual victory of socialism, and there was a strong socialist contingent in the state legislature beginning in 1906 and growing to a substantially larger number in 1910, 1912, and those socialist legislators were playing an important role in passing progressive legislation in Wisconsin, such as unemployment or workmen's compensation in 1911.
Professor Maney, what happened to the progressive movement during World War I?
Well, World War I was really a tough time for all the progressive forces in Wisconsin, including the socialists. But for fighting Bob La Follette, really the founder of Wisconsin progressivism, World War I was pretty devastating. La Follette opposed American entry into the First World War. He thought that it was a war that was not serving any U.S. interests, that it was primarily fostering the imperialistic appetites of Britain and France. So he opposed entry into the war. He voted against conscription. And he really was treated by many people here and around the country as a traitor. And in fact, there was an effort to expel him from the United States Senate. And at the University of Wisconsin, which owed so much to La Follette and progressivism, I mean, really, the reputation of the university goes back to that first decades of the 20th century with the La Follette leadership. At the university, most of these professors that he had brought into government signed a petition to support his expulsion from the United States Senate. So it was a bad time in that sense for La Follette individually. And then progressives, as socialists, were sharply divided about that war. Many many opposed it, as La Follette did, and Victor Berger opposed it, but there were others who supported it. And progressivism really never recovered from the war. La Follette did. His popularity was restored in the early 1920s, largely as a result of his opposition, but the progressive movement itself never really recovered to what it had been before the war.
If we could pursue this a little bit. If La Follette suffered so badly from that position, why did 9 of Wisconsin's 11 congressmen also vote against the war, and what happened to them?
Well, I don't really know the details of what happened to these to the congressmen, but Wisconsin was as sharply divided as any place during the Second World War. I mean, the First World War. And what happened here is that because of the large German population, Wisconsin was under the national microscope as being sort of disloyal. And so Wisconsin kind of had to prove itself. And I don't know what happened. Victor Berger was elected again in 1918, running on an anti-war platform. And he was indicted by the federal government. And he was reelected again and reelected yet a third time. But this was a bad time for Wisconsin, I think, the First World War period.
Yeah, maybe, John, you can answer what I really meant to ask is why this heavy vote against the war in Wisconsin is really what I was asking, not the fate of the individual Congress people.
Well, the obvious answer, I suppose, is the heavy German American population here, as well as, I suppose, some principled thought about it. But what I was going to say is the interesting repercussions from this. First of all, the short-term repercussions during the 20s when La Follette came back in 1922 to run for re-election. He won by an overwhelming majority, so he was vindicated. And that was good temporarily for the progressives. And of course, there was a progressive governor, John J. Blaine, during the first 6 years of the 1920s. But his sons, Bob and Phil, remembered that. And of course, they too were vilified during the war. And being persecuted like that, they remembered it all the more in the late 1930s. And they were determined that this would not happen again. And this, I think, convinced them in their isolationism. So they thought that history was repeating itself in the late 1930s up until Pearl Harbor. To get a little bit ahead of the story, that foreign policy issue really tore the progressives apart once again in the late 30s and 40s. And they may have recovered temporarily. Well, they recovered in the 20s and 30s, but they fell apart in the 40s in large part, I think, over that foreign policy issue.
We'll come back to that foreign policy issue and also to the Wisconsin idea issue. Mayor Zeidler, progressives' reaction toward World War I.
Well,
Excuse me, the socialist reaction.
the socialist reaction was perhaps stronger against the First World War than the progressive reaction, because the progressives included, although some German rural support, also some people of Yankee and Norwegian ancestry. In the socialist movement, the idea was that wars are capitalist wars and the working class shouldn't be fighting each other. And as it was pointed out, Victor Berger got indicted when he was running for Congress in order to defeat him, and he was hauled up before Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis. I think he given a 20-year sentence in the process. He was able to beat it ultimately, but Congress refused to seat him when he got elected. The second time they refused to seat him. Finally, he was seated in 1922. But the socialist movement, likewise, did not recover from that, because when the war started, the persons with British Isles ancestry generally tended to leave the socialist movement and left. There were some Irish and English left in the socialist movement, but it was largely left with Central European population. The Berger's paper, the Milwaukee Leader, lost its mailing rights and it never recovered. It limped along through the 20s and died in the 30s. So the First World War really was destructive. And it was destructive in a second way, that it led to the rise of the communist movement in Russia, which had its influence in the United States. And communists tended to recruit from the socialist movement, so that there was a major split nationally of the socialist movement in 1919. And all thereafter, because the communists used the word socialist, that the socialist movement had a hard time identifying itself as a movement essentially democratic. This was not a problem that the progressives had, although in one or two cases they may have had the problem of being thought of as communists. So the First World War was also destructive to the socialist movement.
I think that's a problem the Socialist Party has always faced, is the erroneous assumption that somehow being socialist is undemocratic. And the Socialist Party of America was very democratic in its outlook.
Yeah, almost chaotically so.
Yes. It's interesting that the Socialist Party's governing body was elected by referenda. In the early years of the party mechanism was almost crippled because of various referenda. Berger himself preferred the term social democrat to socialist, and whereas the National Party was known as the Socialist Party after 1901, the Wisconsin Party was known as the Social Democrats until 1916, when they felt they needed to change the name to distinguish themselves from the German Social Democrats. The other effect, though, of the war is that it pushed Berger and the progressives, the Wisconsin socialists and the progressives, together. In 1922, the socialists did not run a senatorial candidate against La Follette. There's a story that Oscar Ameringer tells. It's the only evidence we have for it. We don't know if all the details are right, but supposedly Berger was approached by emissaries from the Republican Party with an offer to pay his campaign expenses if he would run against La Follette, and with a promise to drop possible prosecution against him after the Supreme Court struck down his first conviction. He declined to do that, and the socialists did not run a candidate against La Follette for Senate in 1922, and in 1924 they gave up their place on the ticket to Bob La Follette for his 1924 Progressive Party presidential candidacy.
I think it would be interesting to note that while you think the progressive movement disappeared, it and the centrist socialists migrated in 1938, 1940, thereafter, into the Democratic Party and rejuvenated the Wisconsin Democratic Party in the image of the Progressive Party.
Well, Mayor Hone, the longtime mayor of your city,
he was
ran for what, governor in 1944 as a Democrat?
42, I think. Yeah, he was one of the leaders, but there was a whole set a rank and file that went in there. Some feeling that Berger might have become a Roosevelt Democrat because first, the rise of the Nazis, and secondly, because the labor movement went into the Democratic Party with persons who had been leaders in the Progressive Party. If you look at the Democrats in the 50s, you'll see many of them, the Democratic leaders, came out of the Progressive movement.
Wasn't there a real contradiction there that he would have had to overcome, though, to become a Roosevelt Democrat? Because Roosevelt was a capitalist at heart.
Roosevelt had the ability of getting Southern war bonds and the New York Communist Party together. He could have included Berger.
Berger himself, too, was a small capitalist. I think there was the mistaken notion that the socialists of the early part of the 20th century wanted to abolish all of private property. He owned several corporations and was a small businessman, invested in the stock market, and the kinds of things that Berger advocated, I think he might have found a comfortable place in the Democratic Party. Old age pensions, he introduced the first old age pension bill in Congress, the predecessor of Social Security, unemployment compensation, workman's compensation, things that found a place in the Democratic Party. Upton Sinclair wrote, "The American people will take socialism, but they won't take the label." And,
that's what strikes me to listen to this. It has to be a real kind of eye-opener for people to know that socialists played such a role in Wisconsin history, because it's such a bad word in a way. I mean, liberal, nobody wants to be called a liberal, much less a socialist, but it played a big role in Wisconsin history, and also is very respectable. One of the persons in that 1912 presidential contest, you mentioned three, but the fourth place finisher was Eugene V. Debs, who was highly respected. He was called the Lincoln of the left, and the person who called him that, I believe, was Woodrow Wilson. In Wisconsin and elsewhere, I think the socialists and the progressives kind of had a symbiotic relationship in a way. I mean, Fighting Bob and his sons, part of their strength was to offer an alternative to the socialist, and I think a capitalist alternative to the socialist. I think that was part of their success. But again, it just strikes me that I know when I teach classes and talk about socialism, most students just are stunned that in this country there were such terrible things as socialists. But they were pretty respectable. And one other thing I would say, I would suggest that if you want a little history, to read the sort of the socialist comparable to the Contract of America, I guess, of its time, the Blue Book. Read the socialist platform in the Blue Book, and one thing that's revealing, it doesn't differ all that much from the progressive platforms, but it's pretty, even by today's standards, it seems pretty moderate, and there are not a whole lot of things that most voters would object to.
One of the things the progressives stood for in most accounts is open government, honest government. Now, Professor Miller, comment on that, and then I'm going to suggest we talk about whether Wisconsin was ahead of its time in that regard.
Well, it was ahead of its time in so many things, but open, honest government, I think yes, in the sense that there was integrity there. Certainly the La Follettes, all three generations for that matter, I think measure up to that. But openness in another sense too, and that is one of the basic notions of progressivism is that of exposure and of enlightening the people, educating the people. And one way in which La Follette did this early on was to read the roll call as he went around. Of course, he used it as a political weapon against his enemies, but he wanted the public to know who was voting for this and who was voting for that. He starts La Follette's Weekly in 1909. That today is the Progressive magazine, as an effort, again, to educate the people, to open up government. The Legislative Reference Service. In fact, the whole Wisconsin idea of linking the government, the state government, with the state university, and of bringing experts into government to help administer it and to help write the legislation and of using the government in its way to help promote the interests of the university, I think is part of this notion that the people shall rule, and if the people are adequately enlightened and educated, then, government will work and the society will progress.
Dr. Maney, you referred to the Wisconsin idea earlier. Want to elaborate on that a little bit and the role of the progressives in it?
Well, basically the Wisconsin idea was using experts from the University of Wisconsin to help write legislation and then to help implement that legislation. And a lot of historians have seen in the Wisconsin idea, which originated here during the first decade of the 20th century, as really the precursor of FDR's brain trust. And it went not only from here, but practically every state had its own version eventually of the Wisconsin idea. So this was one of the kind of lasting legacies of La Follette. And just one other thing that's sort of connected to this that I thought of when John Miller was talking. La Follette had, and again, this is rare. I'm always struck by how things are different now than they were then. La Follette had toward people a total lack of any condescension. He would talk for 3 hours, and if his speeches, somebody said that his speech, he would prepare for a speech as though he were writing a book. And if you read his speeches, they are fact-filled. They look like a tightly reasoned legal brief, and they're boring, as a legal brief would be as well. But this guy had the ability to get up at a county fair on a hay wagon, and talk to the grandstand and bring life into the speech. And he would talk for 2 hours or 3 hours, give all these facts, and people at the end would clap and ask for more. But I think more than the technique, he was a great orator, but there was this absolute belief that if people got the facts, that they would make the right decision. And so there was never on his part any kind of manipulation. It was just to present his ideas and to support them with as much information as he could, and then he thought then people will make the right decision. Now, I have to say that as time went on, his sons to a large extent had that faith, but I think by the 1940s they had lost it. And young Bob, the fellow I studied, one of the reasons he was decided really not to fight for his Senate seat and eventually lost to Joe McCarthy was, I think he did not any longer believe that he could appeal to people by reason, and there was so much gimmickry in politics, and people were becoming so susceptible to manipulation. So I think even within the La Follettes, you can see something of that original spirit is lost over the decades.
Was his death in any way related to that change of attitude?
His suicide, young Bob's suicide in 1953. That's an awfully complicated story, and I don't know what caused his suicide. He was defeated by Joe McCarthy in 1946. There were some who said that he felt guilty about not having defeated McCarthy and retained his seat. I think there were other evidence that he was suffering from depression. He was in very poor health. Part of the answer to his death really, too, goes back to his childhood and upbringing, the high standards that his parents kind of imposed on him and the other members of the family. And mostly, I think it was he was an exceptional politician, as his father was, but he never really wanted to go into politics. He did it more out of loyalty to his father. And so there was a sense that he wasn't ever doing what he wanted to do most, and then he was defeated in 1946, and he couldn't live with politics, and in a way he couldn't live without politics. And so I think that's a kind of a sad end to the La Follette legacy.
I'd like to pick up on this a little bit too, with the notion of old Bob La Follette traveling around the state and giving 2- and 3-hour speeches. By the 1930s, people I don't think were quite willing to listen that long, although in his National Progressives of America speech at the Stock Pavilion in 1938, it went 1 hour and 40 minutes. But Phil would travel around the state in the back of a car driven by his chauffeur and look at those little black notebooks to see who he was going to meet at the town up ahead and give 7 or 8 speeches, running apparently on about a $4,000 campaign budget back in the 30s. And it was basically, friends and neighbors pressing the flesh, just like his dad. He loved to do it, and he communicated with people. But radio was beginning to come in, and to get his legislative program across, he gave those 15-minute radio speeches, and he always admired Roosevelt. He envied Roosevelt, that great crooner, he said. That Roosevelt had that great ability to communicate over the radio, and he wished that he might have done the same thing. But, of course, now everything's entirely different, and we communicate mainly by the TV tube and not by that personal interaction. That really
Sound bites. They were not, the La Follettes were not high on the
So
sound
would
bites.
any of the three have survived 2-minute sound bites or less?
I don't think so.
I don't think they were capable of sound bites.
But let me shade one thing that you said about Bob La Follette not manipulating the message. Bob was more of the propagandist for the progressive movement rather than the implementer. He would often say, I'm not going to compromise for the half loaf, I want the full loaf, and distinguishing himself from Teddy Roosevelt, for instance. And yet if you look at the record, more often than not, when it came down to it, he was willing to cut the deal and set the half loaf. In some ways, he reminds me a bit of a radio talk host, and I could see him surviving in that environment, because he liked to paint his enemy as not merely someone who he differed with, but who was evil, who was an enemy. In many ways.
Yeah, I guess that's, there's some indication of that, but what strikes me about the elder La Follette was that, unlike so many politicians, it seems to me that he became more sort of militant over the years. Most politicians, once they get into office, realize that it's a lot more complicated governing than it is campaigning for office. La Follette was a more militant governor than he had been a candidate. He was a more militant senator than he had been a governor. And so, I think that's what I see with him, that he was never satisfied, and especially later in his career, he seems to be so uncompromising. So, yes, he was a good politician, and he wanted to get things done, and you do find some compromises, but more what strikes me is the insurgent in him, who kind of was, I think, almost unique among political figures of that time. Fighting Bob.
One of the things I think you ought to think about when you're talking about old Bob La Follette is, why did this movement go? In 1938 and 39, many of the followers of the progressives had moved into the Democratic Party because of the Wagner Labor Relations Act, Old Age and Security Act. And when in 1941 and 1940, the La Follette supported the Democrats, their followers were in that party. When they decided in 44 to go back into the Republican Party, they had lost their following. Their following were now Democrats. And when Robert Jr. ran in 1946, people who would have voted for him were voting in the Democratic primary, so that he had lost his following. Part of that loss was due to the fact that there was a perception among the labor movement and others that Phil La Follette was moving in the direction of conservatism, particularly with his national progressive movement, with a little button with the cross in it indicating a voting cross, but looked too much like a swastika. And he lost on that, so that when the 40s came, their following was now in the Democratic Party, and they didn't go there. They went back to the Republican Party and couldn't maintain their base there.
Let's stay in the 30s. Our goal tonight is to try to get the background up to so that the next session can talk about McCarthyism. Let's talk about the La Follette brothers in the 30s, the younger generation. How did they get along? What was their relationship, politically, personally?
Well, this was a very close-knit family, a family that's recently been described by Bernard Weisberger in his new book on love and politics in progressive Wisconsin as one that was very tight-knit and supportive. And obviously, old Bob, as well as his wife, Belle Case LaFollette, who was a remarkable woman, created a standard that was both admirable and something that none of the children could really ever quite live up to. And there were expressions of love back and forth in letters, but I think especially Bob and Phil had a hard time fully expressing their emotional feelings to each other, which came out, I think, as time went on in the 1930s. Phil was ready to go with that Progressive Party in 1930. Bob was reluctant. Bob was hesitant. In 1938, Phil wanted to go with the NPA, the National Progressives of America. Bob wanted to have nothing to do with it, but he reluctantly went along. They fought against the war, then Pearl Harbor comes. Phil volunteers for Army duty, and he goes off to fight in the Pacific Theater, actually to serve on Douglas MacArthur's public relations staff. And Bob resents this because he's back in Washington fighting the battle while his brother is run off to play war games. And in long letters back and forth between Phil and his wife, Ison, you really get to see this, and letters back and forth to Bob, that there was a strain, a definite strain, and things that might not have been said earlier now came to the forefront. So there were tensions, I think, based on their personality, on their background, and also on their political strategies.
Well, I mean, what's interesting is the Fighting Bob really groomed young Bob as his successor. But young Bob didn't want to go into politics. Phil did. And then in 1925, when the elder LaFollette died, Phil was too young to run for the Senate. Young Bob was just over 30. He was became the youngest senator since Henry Clay. That was always hard for Phil to take. Then in about 1928, Phil wanted to run for governor. And the mother was still alive. Belle Case was still alive, and she said, you can't run for governor because it will jeopardize Bob's reelection. And so all these years, this is building up. I mean, why is it that Phil is thinking, it's kind of like, mother loves you better attitude in the family. And it builds up and then boils over in the 1940s. And there, in these letters that John referred to, there is really great hostility vented on both sides. And on Bob's side, too, there is the feeling that Phil had frequently led him into things that he shouldn't have gotten involved in. So it's a fascinating family that largely dominated Wisconsin politics, but a very complex relationship that exists among all the family members.
How did this affect then the actual functioning in the political scene? Did they agree on the kinds of programs that Phil proposed as governor, for example? I realize senator and a governor don't necessarily work together, but were they in a basic agreement?
Well, Bob was in Washington, and he was being a senator, and Phil was in Madison, and Phil pretty much ran the state, or at least, he was the issue. You were either with Phil or against Phil. Everybody liked Bob, but Phil was very controversial. And so Bob more or less took a hands-off policy toward what was going on in the state, although they constantly corresponded, and they basically agreed, I'd say 90% on issues. It wasn't a matter of disagreement on issues so much. It was a division of labor, I think you could say.
One thing I think that they are worth remembering, Phil and Bob, and it's in the 1930s, Phil was governor of the state for 3 terms. Young Bob was a very prominent senator and sometimes talked about as a possible successor to FDR. In fact, FDR even told some of his advisors that if he did not, FDR didn't run in 1940 for a 3rd term. He wanted young Bob LaFollette to run. So Wisconsin and these 2 LaFollette brothers really appeared in the 30s to be the wave of the future. They got an incredible amount of attention, especially in 1934 after the founding of this Progressive Party. And who could have predicted at that time that this was really actually not the beginning of a new movement that would sweep the country, but really the twilight of Wisconsin progressivism. But they're both interesting. And young, we haven't mentioned it yet, but the elder LaFollette in the 1950s was selected by a committee of the United States Senate as one of the 5 greatest senators of all time, along with Webster and Clay and John C. Calhoun and Robert Taft. That's pretty good company. And I think young Bob would make a list of 12 or so great senators in American history. So these are pretty remarkable people we're talking about here. And you can always exaggerate the personalities, I think, and the leadership, and certainly there was more to progressivism than La Follett's, but they're worth remembering too.
Mayor Zeidler in the 30s, the socialist relationship with the progressives, the younger La Follett's.
Well, in the 30s, the socialists in Milwaukee gained a considerable success in 1932 when they elected 3 out of 4 citywide officers and almost half of the Common Council. But in 1935, when so many votes that the AFL was losing in the Wisconsin legislature, because there were 4 parties at the time, the Democratic Party, the Progressive Party, the Republican Party, and the Socialist Party, and the most reactionary of them was the Democratic Party, that the AFL demanded of the Socialist City Hall leaders in Milwaukee that they get off the ballot and go into the Progressive Party, because of the progressive legislation was very favorable to, progressive proposed legislation was very favorable to the labor movement. And after a considerable soul searching inside the Socialist Party, the party did go off the ballot, went into the Progressive Party under the name of the Farmer Labor Progressive Federation, in which there were supposed to be 25 component units. It developed later on that the major component was the old socialist movement. And that movement had some success, I think, in the 38 election. But thereafter, the progressives didn't realize that their constituency, particularly the labor constituency, was now Democratic. And when they suffered a defeat, I think in the 40 election, that caused soul searching on the part of both the socialists and the progressives. Now, the Follett's could not get themselves, although in 1940 they supported and were affiliated with the Franklin Roosevelt, couldn't get themselves into the mood to go over into the Democratic Party, and decided to go back into the Republican Party. And I think that, as I said before,